Yeah, we must.
All right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Where we're going with this, we want to eventually talk about the English translations that we currently have at our disposal. But before we do that, it makes it fitting to talk about where the English translation came from, and we've talked about the Old Testament written in Hebrew and the New Testament written in Greek. So we've covered pretty much that. But we haven't really spent a lot of time on the history of the English translations. You know, some people think, well, the King James Version was the first English translation out there, and it's not. And I'm not going to do a full detailed analysis of it. It's just going to be a summary. Joe can fill in some of the gaps because I don't know if you know, Joe has really spent a lot of time on English translations. How did that become a passion of yours?
Grew up with the King James Bible in our Claysburg Church of the Brethren, and around somewhere after fourth grade, when the community Bible school got together.
Oh, yeah, he
For
told
2
me this
weeks
story.
after school was out, the same buses went around, picked up all the kids, and different churches had different age groups. And fourth and fifth grade was in the Lutheran church. And a fella, Bobby, came with this newfangled thing called the Revised Standard Version. And the Sunday school or the Bible school teachers sort of ooh and awed over that, and we, we're sort of excited. We liked it. It was a lot easier to understand than the King James Version. So of course we all had our King James Version, but every time we had scripture, I had Bobby read from the Revised Standard Version, just so much easier to understand. And didn't see it in the Church of the Brethren in the Middle District. Probably was some church that had it, but the only thing I found was this thing called the American Standard Version, which to me was just about as bad as the King James Version. It came from 1901 and was the American update of the Revised Version that England did in the late 1800s, 90s. So I said, okay, why all these different Bible versions? And I hit 1970 in college. Our pastor's daughter, Alberta Hott, was a librarian in the Huntington Library, ordering this newfangled thing called the New English Bible, the latest thing out of England, which was an update of their Revised Version, which was the update of the King James Version. So she got this for me and said, wow, this is even more impressive. And that just started this journey of why all these different translations and how they tie together. That's been a fascination.
Sure. And what Joe has done is he's gone back. He has a good handle on the earlier translations. We talked about the Wycliffe Bible or the Wycliffe Bible, however you want to pronounce it. Just like Vietnam or Vietnam, Wycliffe, Wycliffe, Iraq. Take your choice. There are different ways to pronounce things. Yeah, Joe's been very helpful to me. Some of these earlier translations we're going to talk about, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, but we will slow down and give Joe a chance should he wish. So what we talked about last time was the Bible for the early church was primarily a Greek translation. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but even before the Old Testament was finished being written, there was already a call for the Old Testament to be translated into Greek, because Greek was becoming the standard language of that area. So when the new church has a Bible, their sacred scripture, or at least they're moving in that direction of having a sacred scripture, it's a Greek translation. Then when we get to the early Middle Ages, we're moving into the late fourth century and then well into the fifth century. Latin is now the primary language of the land. It's a language of the sciences, language of theology, that kind of thing. And so the church adopts the Latin version of the Old Testament. And there's quite a bit of history to get to that Latin version. There's the Old Latin, and then there's, you may have heard of the Vulgate by Jerome. So I'm not going to get into all the specifics on that. But we have a Latin version of the Bible, and that was the Bible of the church up until I'm going to say the 1500s, the Reformation, although that's still a little, that's pushing it. There were some English translations before that. But that was the Bible of the church. And the church considered, and this is important, the church considered it to be heretical to come up with a translation of the Bible. Let's say you're in Germany, a German translation, so everyone could read it, or if you're in England, an English translation. And the reason why, and we talked about this last time, is that was a way for the church to have control over how the Bible was used and how it was interpreted. Because Latin was pretty much a language for people who were educated. So a lot of people didn't know Latin. So that was a way to control it. So as we get toward the end of the Middle Ages, there is a call, an extreme yearning for people to have access to the Bible themselves. They just didn't want to have their clergy rendition or interpretation or whatever. They wanted to read it for themselves. They really didn't have that opportunity. We take it for granted. We not only can we have a Bible, we can choose what English translation we want to read. And that wasn't the case, in the time period we're talking about. So that's just kind of a summary of what we talked about last week, or just want to make sure we're on the same page. If you have any questions before we start getting into the English translations prior to the King James.
So you said that the church kept the Bible in Latin, so they controlled the interpretation and what have you of the word. But I mean, was that really did they actually sit down and was it that sinister that they said, hey, we don't want everybody else to understand, we want to do the interpretation? I mean, was there, you know what I mean? Did they have a meeting where they actually said that, or did it just happen, and looking back on it, we would say that was there?
Yeah, I'm not sure there was a sinister meeting saying, but during that time, there were things. I mean, we have the Spanish Inquisition, and we have, the church in prison or house arrest, I guess, Galileo, because he said everything revolved around the sun. He had a heliocentric view, but the church had a geocentric view. Everything had to revolve around us. It had to revolve around the earth. So when Galileo comes up with this thing revolving around the sun, so the church was at the center, and they had power, they had control. So maybe there was some sinister in it, but they just weren't going to give that up. So if you look at the Middle Ages, which is also called the Dark Ages, there's a lot of things about the church that we might not be proud about. And this
There still are.
Yeah.
Also, were they also, at that point in time, was it also all politics as well? It's like the church and the state were so
Well, they were
closely
one and
tied
the same,
together,
weren't they?
right?
Yeah, there wasn't as much of a separation between church and state as we have now. So, yeah, I mean, and we'll get into that, especially when we talk about Henry VIII and English translations. Go ahead.
I can't, I'm dusting off a lot of cobwebs here, but I think one time did a course on the Middle Ages. And
Yeah.
I'm remembering that like Benedict, that started like the Benedictine monks, like around that time. Everybody in the Roman Empire thought they were speaking Latin. And then Benedict said, well, you're all speaking these little local dialects. We need to add some uniformity. So he wanted to make Latin the language of the church and a
Yeah.
Latin Bible that they could all use. And it kind of fell apart on him because all of a sudden everybody in Spain realized, well, that's not what we call Latin. And people in France said, that's not what we call Latin. And
Right.
people in Italy say, that's not what we call Latin. And they just realized that, oh, you're speaking Italian, you're speaking French, and you're speaking Spanish. But that it was this push to make a uniform language and understanding. But Benedict wanted to make is that jive with your?
Well, not really. I mean, and it's
Yeah, I guess
not,
it's
I don't know enough to say that, yeah. So I'm not saying it doesn't, but I can't really pinpoint that.
An anecdote from my son's Latin experience at the university. He was instructed by his Latin advisor not to talk to the clerical side of the university because their Latin was not standard ancient Latin. It was a church Latin. It was a different style of Latin.
So I think with Glenn's question and with Joe's comment, you know, it's hard when you're dealing with a vast geographical expanse to have one universal language, because you're going to have dialects, because Latin was spoken, and we don't really speak it now. It's an academic language, and but it was both. It was an academic language and it was spoken. So yeah, I'd have to look into Benedict. I can't even put a time period to him in my head right now. So I'm having trouble with that. But I wanna look into that, Glenn.
We don't need to go down that rabbit hole. It's just something I'm
Yeah.
just
Well,
busting off there in my head.
okay, we won't. We won't.
Latin Bible right about that time was.
You can research that for
And bring it back
next
to my
week.
learning issue.
That will be your learning.
And we won't, except to say that it is, just to repeat what I just said, there's gonna be variations and,
Well, wasn't, but getting back to an earlier comment, the church politically ruled in a lot, and especially Henry VIII ran up to that.
Yeah.
There was
Sure.
a lot of it wasn't religious, it was.
yeah, there was really no separation between church and state, and yeah, they were. And you know, there will be some times when maybe the monarch or whoever the leader of the country wasn't all that interested in religious issues, but when they wanted to be, or if they wanted to use them for their advantage, then they would do that. You know, we will talk about Henry VIII in a minute. So this is good, because, you know, languages get tricky, and we do have different dialects, and we'll see that. Well, you know that already by reading the King James Bible and then reading like a New Living Translation or even the New Revised Standard Version or whatever. There are differences, and the King James Bible was a very good translation for its time, and we will talk about that. But if you look at our handout, we want to start talking about in 1382, a Bible that we call the Wycliffe Bible was translated, and this was the first complete English translation of the Bible. And it was translated from Latin, not from the Hebrew, not from the Greek, but it was translated from the Latin. John Wycliffe, he was an academic, Catholic priest, also a professor of theology at the University of Oxford.
Why is there a question mark with the date on that one?
Not sure.
There were two events going on.
Okay,
Wycliffe did not do the whole Bible translation. He did, I think, the New Testament and a few of the Old Testament chapters. And some associate, there's actually a group, 3 or 4 of them working together. Wycliffe gets the main name for that. Coverdale was also working with them, and he did a bunch of what Wycliffe did not, and eventually a completed, updated Wycliffe comes out as a Coverdale Bible. And if you do anything with the Church of England, they still like to use the Coverdale translation of the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer. And that comes from the same time frame.
but even before we get to the Coverdale Bible, in 1384, see the 1382 version, and I think the reason I have a question mark there is that, Wycliffe did not translate the whole thing. In fact, Joe, there are some people who even question how much translating he actually did.
It's very sketchy.
It is, when you're looking back that far. So we try to talk in generalities, not to get, too caught up. But that's, I think, why I put that question mark there.
I'm gonna backtrack, it was Tyndale and Coverdale working together, not,
That's what I thought, but,
Yeah.
I would, we'll get there.
This, when I looked at this, it said 1382,
Yes,
Wycliffe. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law were sent by, I don't know, Mennonite Central Committee, I guess, to Argentina, Formosa, to help the Toba natives upgrade their New Testament.
yeah,
And that was Wycliffe. Wow.
okay.
And I don't, I mean,
So they were using a Wycliffe translation.
I don't know.
There's an organization called Wycliffe that does
Okay,
translations of
yeah.
Bibles all over
Is
the
that-
world.
yeah, that's what I
People.
Yeah, that's what it would be.
That's
See,
what it is.
there,
I've heard of
you have the Tyndale Bible, you have a Tyndale Publishing House,
That's one of the two states.
and so forth, so, yeah, that
Okay,
was,
so
yeah,
that's-
don't confuse that with the translation.
Well, that's what I wondered.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
okay.
no, that's it.
Okay.
That name, has, significance throughout, religious publishing and so forth. Just leave it at that. But one of Wycliffe's main goal was to, work at this idea of having the Bible in the hands of, everyone. So, I don't think he was, a linguist in the sense that he was, well-trained in the Greek, the ancient languages, Hebrew and Greek, so he translated from the Latin. So that's your first, English translation
How
that
did
you
the
have.
church feel about him doing that? Were they like cool with it or not so much?
They were not cool.
Not cool with
Uh,
it.
Put down, not cool.
In fact, in 1408, and he died in 34, I think. 84, I'm sorry. Yeah, he died in 84, and before I answer your question, just want to throw it in there. A second version of Wycliffe was started. The first one was more of a word for word translation, and then he wanted to have more of a freer translation that would bring in everyday English language. So that was a more flexible, freer translation. He had started that, but then he died in 84, and then I think the date I have is that was finished in 88, 1388.
One of his associates.
Yeah. Yeah, there were several people working with him, according to what I read. His followers completed the version. And that hung around for a while. It was there. And then in 1408, he died in 1384. In 1408, the church condemned the Wycliffe Bible. So that was not allowed, you weren't allowed to have access to that. And again, the church, had frowned upon that. Why they let him get that far, I'm
Yeah,
not
why did he
sure.
not like get in trouble or something? While he was alive.
He's dead then.
Right, but before then, they were like, oh, you're doing that, and they just like waited till after he died.
Was he telling everybody? I mean, if he didn't tell
He had-
anybody, they may have never.
Oh, no, I think, his idea was to get it out there, so. Now, when was the Gutenberg? Gutenberg wasn't,
1440.
yeah,
I
so,
wrote it down last.
so we didn't have that yet.
Yeah,
So,
the printing press was-
so it would have been a slower process.
He also had a very powerful British ally, John of Gaunt. Was a
Okay.
very powerful in line for the king of England and had family members and he sided with Wycliffe. And if it had not been for John of Gaunt, the church would have shut him down a lot earlier.
Okay, that's the question, that answers that, and that goes back to what Peggy's been saying for the last 10 minutes or so about politics.
Yeah.
Politics are involved in this. The other thing I want to mention before we move on from Wycliffe is that this was the first English Bible to have it divided into chapter divisions. And I'm usually asked that question, okay, when did that start? It starts in early part of the 13th century. I'm gonna say, well, what do I have here? I know I ran into some different dates on this. Some said 1225, that must be down here, yeah. I have 1205, so I'm just gonna say sometime in the early part of the 13th century, in the 1200s. A professor of theology in Paris, Stephen Langton, who then became the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's the one who started this. And he did it with the Latin version because that's what they had. And the Langton chapter divisions pretty much hold sway up until today. I mean, I'm sure there have been changes, but that pretty much held. People didn't mess with that too much. Not to say that they did sometimes.
Well, that brings up a question I have. In Latin, you mean, say, the book of John? Was the whole, nothing was divided into verses and chapters?
No, not until this time. You had scrolls and then you had parchments and then you had just,
They had
Book forms.
sentences.
Hmm?
Did they have sentences?
yeah. Well, but they had
Well,
sentences,
yeah.
but the chapter divisions come first and then the verse divisions come next. So it wasn't until the 1440s that a rabbi divided the Old Testament into verses. And then when we get to the Geneva Bible in 1560, look down your handout. This is the first English translation that has chapter divisions and verse divisions. And then we pretty much hold sway to that. I mean, they pretty much stuck. And subsequent translations would have the chapter and verse division.
So it really read like a novel or something.
Well, no, it
I mean,
would have
well,
read
they don't
like the
have-
Bible. I mean, the reason they put the divisions in there is so that they could reference. But, so, okay, you wanna talk about a specific chapter, because, you're talking about a long document that's going from, down the road here, and, there was a need. The more the Bible got into the hands of, everyday people, there was a need to have references. Now, I can't tell you how they did that. You know, how the clergy did it and how the scholars and even the scribe, when they were copying one manuscript to another, even way back when, you know, when they were copying Hebrew manuscripts and Greek manuscripts, how they made sense of all that things.
There is a group in Britain, Tyndale House, is an academic scholarly group that's working on printed versions of the Greek Bible that's different than some of the other big name publications. They focus on manuscripts in the first 5 centuries. And part of their shtick at Tyndale House is to look at how they divided the text. And they more or less had like section divisions, not paragraph divisions, but like story divisions, or the fancy term pericope divisions, the different stories. And so the Tyndale House Greek New Testament takes these ancient divisions and puts that into their modern print version, as well as all of the variations in spelling. They're the one Greek printed New Testament that basically sticks to Vaticanicus and uses that as their primary. So they call it a diplomatic version, where they stick to one manuscript and put variations that the other manuscripts had in footnotes. But they show all the variations in spelling, which Nestle Aland and UBS standardized throughout, just to show the variation was in the manuscripts.
So I haven't done a lot of work with the ancient manuscripts, but you know, what Joe's saying and what I do know, you know, there were divisions. There just weren't chapter divisions. So to tell you how those divisions work and all that, I can't.
So I'm curious, you're talking about he wanted to get the Bible to the everyday
Yes.
person. But, and I'd have to brush up on what the 1300s were like, or the 1400s. Could the average person even read?
Some,
Probably not.
Or just the wealthy people?
well, yeah, I mean, see, you're talking about, I mean,
I don't remember.
yes, there would have been illiterate people, but there would be people who could have access to the Bible if you live in Germany and it was translated in German and yeah, I mean there would have been some who would have been illiterate, but there would have been some who could read who weren't you know, university educated. So they, if the Bible was in the vernacular or their language, they could read that. But if it's, you know, you have to be, and a small percentage of people, you know, went to the university and learned Latin and some of the other academic languages.
Or even if it's only a few more people, but still more people than used to have it.
Yeah.
And then that's gonna
That's
start to
true.
spread
That's
more
true.
and more. And I don't think if you were working any kind of business that involves trade, you would have to know your letters, like you'd have to know how to read basically.
Yeah,
So there's some, but yeah, you're right, not everything.
in fact, you know, some have argued that trade and commerce, it would be helpful if you knew Latin.
Oh,
Because it was, you know, if you're trading locally in Germany or in England, fine. You can do it in German and English, but again, the universal language is Latin for a while. Okay, I think that might be enough for Wycliffe. The main takeaways here for the Wycliffe Bible, it's early, 1382, another version in 1384. It's the first English the first English translation. It does come from the Latin. And the other thing is it's the first English translation to have chapter divisions that Stephen Langton came up with. Now we're going to go to the Tyndale Bible. Now, remember, we're jumping here. We're jumping from 1382 to 1525. Now, we talked about the Reformation last time. Do you know a date that is commonly given to the Luther Reformation?
1525.
How about a little bit earlier? 1525 is on your handout. That's the Tyndale Bible.
400th anniversary a few years ago. I can't remember which year we had that.
Anniversary
Of the Reformation.
of the Reformation. Well, it would have been the date that, you know, I've always worked with. And this would be the year that Martin Luther got really active, 1517, there it is. So in 2017, there was probably that a Reformation 500th anniversary, because we're hitting all that right now, the 500th anniversary. What was it, 1525, the Anabaptist
Yeah.
anniversary, and that's why we have the Anabaptist Bible coming out, why it came out last year and this year. So Tyndale's version comes out during the while the Reformation is getting started and taking off. And what's going on here is Tyndale is a linguist. He's an academic, he's a linguist, he knows Hebrew, he knows Greek, he put in the time to master these languages. So he is doing an English translation from the Greek and the Hebrew. So he starts out with the Greek and he completes the New Testament in 1525. So we have a complete English translation of the New Testament. Then he starts tackling the Old Testament, but he doesn't quite get there. He did, from my records, he did the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, you've heard of that, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. He translated them from Hebrew into English, and that was 1530. And then in 31, I think he did the book of Jonah. And then that was it. He didn't get any further than that. He was executed in 1536 for treason for doing this. And so again, the church was pretty adamant about this. And, but the Tyndale version was very foundation for subsequent versions. So what we want to take away from Tyndale, he's the first person. So we were translating from Latin, and now there seems to be an interest to go back to the early manuscripts as far as we can. And this is really helping us to understand the importance of the King James. It's setting the stage for the King James version, what Tyndale did. He wants to go back to the language base that the Bible was originally written in. So that's the takeaway there, and he was executed for doing this. So again, there's our politics. Now we're on to the Coverdale Bible. Joe has mentioned that. Miles Coverdale was a student of Tyndale, and he published an English translation from the Latin. And he received support from Henry VIII, and mainly because there was tension between Henry VIII and the Catholic Church, and Henry VIII knew that the Catholic Church didn't want people like Coverdale and Tyndale, whatever, but in this case, Coverdale to translate something into English. So he threw his support, somewhat behind Coverdale. And the Coverdale Bible, as Joe hinted, was distributed widely across England and then in some cases has some sway even today. But what was Henry VIII's beef against the Catholic Church?
They wouldn't continue to give him a loan. As he wanted more wives.
Well,
Well, it-
okay, let's just start with the first wife.
Divorce, right?
Yeah,
Divorce.
Divorce.
who
because-
was he married to?
Catherine.
Catherine of Aragon. And Catherine and Henry were not able to have any male children. They had daughters.
Didn't they only just have one daughter?
Maybe it was. It
I think
was
it was just
it
one
was
daughter,
married.
she never had any sons.
it was Mary the first, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, Mary the first,
We'll
Bloody
get
Mary.
there in a minute. Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor, yeah.
Yeah.
So you have and he's also, the way the story goes, he's also infatuated with Anne Boleyn.
Mhm.
You've heard that name, and there's been some recent movies out there. I haven't seen those, but there's been some recent movies on these characters. So he says, okay, forget the Catholic Church. I want an annulment. I want a divorce. And the papacy declined it. And so he says, okay, we're going to break away. So the Church of England does break away, and he gets his divorce. And then he starts throwing his support behind people who want to make English translations of the Bible, want to make the Bible more accessible. And so in 1539, you have Coverdale coming up with another version, but this is an authorized version. It's authorized by the king, it's authorized by the Church of England. And Thomas Cromwell, who was minister to the king, he threw his support greatly behind Coverdale to come up with this great Bible in 1513. And it was primarily a revision of other translations, and it was meant to correct a certain Protestant bias that may have come out of the previous translations, to keep that Church of England or Catholic slant, there you go, slant on it. So again, there's these things going on.
Excuse me, Dave, is this where there's the separation or the elimination of the Apocrypha from the intertestamental books?
Let's see. Well, that does happen in some Bibles coming out on the Reformation. Now, I'm not sure about these translations. Do you have
I
a feel?
think this is really digging deep. I think the separation of the Apocrypha was done by Luther's translation.
That's correct. Thank you.
We
Yeah,
have
Martin
questions.
Luther would have done that. That was part of his Reformation. Now, the brethren, the early brethren were very conversant with the Apocrypha. And then that changed over time. So I don't think, some Reformation movements were okay with including the Apocrypha because the Catholic Church had a part. So, but some definitely, as part of the breakaway from the Catholic Church, took it out.
Could you define that word?
Apocrypha. Okay, the Apocrypha in this sense is we have the Old Testament, we have the New Testament, And then there are some, what we might call deuterocanonical, another
word to
crazy
define.
word.
Yeah.
But that's to say that deuterocanonical, the way I'm using it now, means that these books aren't, so much, might not have quite as much authority as the, 66 books in the Bible. Now, the Apocrypha, gotta find one that has it. This is have it?
The Jerusalem Bible.
This one does, including Apocrypha. So, we've talked about the Apocrypha. That may have been before you started coming, Peg, I don't know, but you've heard of books, trying to get, this is. Oh, here we go.
Is there a specific difference between the word pseudo-canonical, deuterocanonical, and apocrypha? Are they defined differently, or are they all the same?
Well, yeah, that gets tricky now.
What is some Greek? You should know. The Greek apocrypha. Apocrypha means to uncover. Means to not uncover. So that comes from the Greek either.
Yeah, but are they all essentially referring to the same?
Canonical in the Western Catholic Church was the books that were given secondary status.
Yes.
Oh.
As the Deutero,
Yeah,
second.
outside of, you know.
Well, not
that's
just
pseudo, but-
secondary status,
Yeah.
worthy for reading and study, but not for
It's just one of
edicts and principles until the first. I guess it was the around the big council around 1500 when the church declared.
Council of Trent.
Yeah, Council of Trent, that certain
Here, they might-
foundational properties now would be supported from deuterocanonical scripture. Before Council of Trent, it was sort of nice and cute and inspirational, but not authoritative
Okay,
until Council of Trent.
Okay, now, so there are books that we might consider to be apocryphal that didn't make it into the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church then eventually did have come up with, and this was, yeah, did come up with, books that are now in what we call the Apocrypha. There's the Book of Tobit, heard of that maybe, the Book of Judith, additions to Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon. There's Baruch, which was Jeremiah's scribe, then the letter of Jeremiah. Then there are additions to the Book of Daniel, which are Bell and the Dragon, Susanna, and the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Jews. And you probably heard of First and Second Maccabees, and then some of the Orthodox translations would have Third and Fourth Maccabees. So those are some books that are contained in the Apocrypha. And again, the Apocrypha would have books, that currently are part of the Catholic Church and Orthodox Church, but are not part of the Protestant.
Protestant.
Yeah, so you're not gonna really have them, most aren't gonna have them in your Bible. If you have a more comprehensive study Bible, some of them will have that, like this one does.
Are they, okay, what about in the Jewish church, are they part of the Jewish not Bibles, but their,
Oh, and that was, see, the apocryphal, and this is where we talked about it. There was a call for a Greek translation once the Old Testament was being finished. And the Greek translation uh, changed the order of the Old Testament for the Hebrew Bible books, and they added some other books, which ended up being the Apocrypha books. So that goes way back to the early church when they, and then when the Catholic Church, you know, the early church morphed into the Catholic Church, if I may say that.
Yeah,
It just ran into the Catholic Church, and so they kept the Apocrypha. But the Judaism did not, and then when you have the Protestant Reformation come, eventually the eventual result of the Protestant Reformation was to get away from the Apocrypha.
Okay.
So hopefully that
that
catches us up, yeah.
One more.
Good question, yeah.
One more tidbit with that, the early King James printings will contain the Apocrypha until the 1800s, when it became less popular, and it was just cheaper at that point. They were mass printing. There was a British and an American mission group to get the Bible in everyone's hands possible. And that's when they really cut the Apocrypha out to cut down on printing costs.
And one thing this underscores is that, you know, you just don't have a Reformation by Luther. I mean, there's a process. You had Luther, you had Calvin, and he has his form of reforming the Catholic Church. And then you have a man by the name of Zwingli, and those are the more popular names, but you had others. And then when the Church of the Brethren comes around, sometimes we call the Church of the Brethren and others the radical Reformation. They're saying, because if you compare today the Church of the Brethren to Lutheranism or even Reformed churches, they have infant baptism, they have things that, so we felt, the Church of the Brethren felt the Reformation didn't go far enough. So they would be what we call the radical Reformation. So the Reformation was a process, and so it's hard to say. You know, and this whole notion about the Apocrypha, it took time before the smoke cleared, and now we have virtually most Protestant Bibles don't have the Apocrypha. Okay. Now we want to move on to the Geneva Bible, and that was published in 1560.
That's what we just talked about.
Well, yeah,
Sorry, which one was the Great Bible?
Yeah.
that was by Coverdale,
Or the Coverdale.
and
But Cromwell's the one that.
yeah, Cromwell
Okay.
and
Morphed into this.
Henry VIII would have given him great support, and that was an authorized version by the Crown and by the Church of England. So I'm going to say, Joe, that that Bible was, well, when we talk about the cover Bible, was the Great Bible, would that have been more popular than the
Yeah,
Coverdale?
that's where, between Tyndale and the Geneva, really,
Yeah.
it seems to be a big mix in there.
Okay, so we have the Coverdale Bible in 1535, the Great Bible in 1539, so they're both important.
I think the Great Bible was a king's authorization to have it in every church. And that's why it gets the press that it does. In fact,
Right.
it was tied down to the pulpit of the church. It was a big thing, and they didn't want people walking off with it, so it was literally chained to the pulpits.
Was that taken from the Greek or the Latin?
The Great.
From the Greek.
No,
King James.
Miles Coverdale was working from the Latin. So Tyndale started it. He was one of the first of the English translators to work with the original languages. And as I said, he did finish the Old Testament. He did complete the New Testament.
From the Greek.
Yeah, from the Greek. Coverdale is still working with the Latin. And, then we get to the Geneva Bible. This is important. Henry VIII is gone, and his daughter, Mary the First, is now Queen of England. And, she is Catholic, and she, reverses the English Reformation, and she restores Roman Catholicism to England. And so, and she reigned from 1553 to 1558. And while she was in power, a Bible that eventually is called the Geneva Bible is started in England. And they are working from the Hebrew and Greek, and their goal is to have the first full English translation from the Old Testament from Hebrew and the New Testament from Greek. And they actually do this. But they had to flee England because of Mary, Bloody Mary, as Peggy said, or Mary Tudor, Mary the First. And so when she restores Roman Catholicism, then this whole idea of support for English translations goes out the window. And so they have to flee to Geneva, Switzerland, to finish what then was later called the Geneva Bible. I don't know if they had a working title before that, but before they fled to Geneva, I don't think they had in mind that it would have been the Geneva Bible. So, but that was completed in 1560.
Did you say that Queen was the first daughter of Henry VIII?
This is his only daughter. They only
Yeah,
have one child.
Okay,
yeah,
and she was only queen for 5 years and then had to flee.
well, she probably killed.
Well, I don't
The people
remember.
who in the Bible had to.
Yeah,
flee.
she
The
did.
people who wrote the Bible had to flee, she was
Yeah,
still there.
Yeah,
was-
she didn't flee.
They fled from her.
Right, because that's what she got her name Bloody Mary, because she killed a lot of the Protestant leaders.
So. So in 1557, you have the New Testament is translated, by these scholars, and there was a number of them. And see, before you had a major figure and some people supporting them. And now we're getting to the point that we want to have a really good translation from the original languages, and it takes a village. It takes a number of people to do this. And they have to be linguists, they have to be trained in the original languages. But so numerous translations are involved in this. So in 1557, you have the New Testament completed into Greek, from Greek to English. And then in 1560, which is really the completion of the whole Geneva Bible, that's when the Old Testament was completed from Hebrew into English. So by 1560, you had a complete English translation from the original languages, from Greek into Hebrew. And then from then on, that's kind of where it goes. The next translation I'll be talking about is the King James, so I'm going to skip some others. But the Geneva Bible really held sway. I mean, that was pretty much the authoritative Bible from 1560 up until 1611. So there are two firsts here with the Geneva Bible. It's the first full English Bible that goes back to the original languages, Hebrew and Greek. And it's the first English translation that has versification. It has the Bible divided down into verses. And then subsequent translations, especially the King James, are gonna have that as well. So you can see how just by this very brief overview, you know, again, how this is a process and politics got involved and other things, but, you know, this got navigated and, translations were coming about. And then you had Martin Luther and others who were making, German translations. So translations were being made in, respecting countries. So, people, the everyday person then, if they were literate, if they could read, would have access. And then you have the printing press and there was more accessibility. Rick,
So a lot of the English translators, they were being killed for translating this
some,
Bible,
yeah,
but there would have been no finished copies yet, I guess. Like if, let's say the translators were working on it, they were killed, but I had an English translation Bible in my possession. Have I been, you know, if you understand what I'm saying.
yeah, well, I
If
mean.
the common person had one of them Bibles, right, you would have been.
I'd have to brush up on the history of that. I'm sure some. I mean, obviously, when something like this happens, you want to get the top dog. You want to get, you know, you cut off the head of the snake.
Right.
So, I'm going to answer it
Just to
from
think of
that
some of the
point.
others that continued doing this, seeing what happened to the first.
Yeah, there would have been oppression.
Right, it'd be like, I ain't going to.
Yeah, there would have been oppression and they would have, well, I don't know about banned, but then, you know, when Mary, is dethroned in 1558, then the church comes back. I forget who her successor was, but
Wasn't Elizabeth,
yes,
because she was the daughter of Henry VIII from James Seymour.
okay, yeah,
James
there you
Seymour
go.
died after childbirth.
No, no.
Yes, but it was her reincarnation
Okay.
way
Yeah,
back
there,
then.
there, good one.
Yes.
And so,
Or also helped to see.
the Church of England comes back. And then it's the Church of England, you've heard of the Anglican Church. And then here in the US, the Episcopal Church really is an offshoot of the Anglican.
Yeah,
Church
they
of
have
England.
like the Lutheran high and low.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
well.
Lutheran, you have Missouri and whatever now,
Yeah,
or.
so Episcopal is as close to Catholicism and Protestantism as you can get. Lutheranism is pretty darn close. So they're gonna be high churches, what we call high church. And then when you get to Baptist and Brethren, you know, we're less formal, less liturgy, you know, the emphasis is on the sermon, where in the Catholic Church, the emphasis is on communion. And the sermon is called a homily as opposed to a sermon. So you get those differences, you know. And some of you have probably been to some Catholic masses and to Episcopal church and to Lutheran church, and you can see the difference. We are out of time. We'll pick up with King James and then we're gonna move on to English translations, but next time, after we talk about King James, we're going to work on our Bibles that we have. And we're gonna talk about the difference between footnotes and annotated notes. And I have a handout for you. And then I want you to bring your Bibles up front and we'll talk about it. Going to be a show and tell. The visual. Okay, that's where we're headed.